So welcome everybody. We have prepared a puppet show, which we usually do on Wednesday afternoons in Beaver Run in Camphill School. And we would like to show it to you so you can see it from your own homes. It is a story by the Brothers Grimm called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Once upon a time, in the middle of winter, when the flakes of snow were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen sat at a window sewing, and the frame of the window was made of black ebony. And whilst she was sewing and looking out of the window at the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow. And the red looked pretty upon the white snow, and she thought to herself, "Would that I had a child, as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the ebony frame." Soon after that, she had a little daughter, who was as white as snow, and as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony, and she was therefore called Little Snow White. And when the child was born, the queen died. After a year had passed, the king took to himself another wife. She was a beautiful woman, but proud and haughty, and she could not bear that anyone else could surpass her in beauty. She had a wonderful looking glass, and when she stood in front of it and looked at herself in it and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The looking-glass answered, "Thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all." Then she was satisfied, for she knew that the looking-glass spoke the truth. But Snow White was growing up and grew more and more beautiful. And when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the day, and more beautiful than the queen herself. Once, when the queen asked her looking-glass, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" it answered, "Thou art fairer than all who are here, Lady Queen, but more beautiful still is Snow White, as I ween." Then the queen was shocked and turned yellow and green with envy. From that hour, whenever she looked at Snow White, her heart heaved in her breast. She hated the girl so much. And envy and pride grew higher and higher in her heart like a weed, so that she had no peace day or night. She called a huntsman and said to him, "Take the child away into the forest. I will no longer have her in my sight. Kill her, and then come back." The huntsman obeyed and took little Snow White with him into the forest. But when he had drawn the knife and was about to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep and said, "Ah, dear huntsman, leave me my life. I will run away into the wild forest and never come home again." And as she was so beautiful, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Run away then, poor child." And yet it seemed as if a stone had been rolled from his heart, since it was no longer needful for him to kill her. But now the poor child was all alone in the great forest, and so terrified that she looked at all the leaves on the trees and did not know what to do. Then she began to run. She ran as long as her feet would go, until it was almost evening. And then she saw a little cottage, and went into it to rest herself. Everything in the cottage was small, but neater and cleaner than can be told. There was a table on which was a white cover, and 7 little plates, and 7 little mugs. Against the wall stood 7 little beds side by side. Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she ate a little bit from each plate and drank from each mug, for she did not wish to take all from only one. Then she was so tired, she laid herself down on one of the little beds. But none of them suited her. One was too long, another too short. But at last, the 7th was just right. And so she remained, said her prayer, and went to sleep. When it was quite dark, the owners of the cottage came back. They were 7 little dwarfs who dug and delved in the mountains for ore. They saw someone had been there, for everything was not in the same order in which they had left it. The first one said, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" The second, "Who has been eating off my plate?" The third, "Who has been taking some of my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been eating my vegetables?" The fifth, "Who has been using my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The seventh, "Who has been drinking out of my mug?" Then the first looked around and saw that there was a little hollow in his bed, and he said, "Who has been getting into my bed?" The others came up and called out, "Someone has been in my bed also." But the 7th, when he looked and saw little Snow White, who was lying asleep therein, he called the others, who came running, and they cried out with astonishment when they saw Snow White. "Oh heavens, oh heavens," they cried, "what a lovely child!" When Snow White awoke, she was frightened when she saw the 7 dwarfs. But they were friendly and asked her what her name was. "My name is Snow White," she answered. "How have you come to our house?" said the dwarfs. Then she told them that her stepmother had wished to have her killed, but the huntsman had spared her life, and that she had run for the whole day, until at last she had found their dwelling. The dwarf said, "If you will take care of our house, cook, make the beds, wash, sew and knit, if you will keep everything neat and clean, you can stay with us, and you shall want for nothing." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart." And so she stayed with them. She kept the house in order for them, while they went off into the mountains and looked for copper and gold. And in the evenings they came back and the supper was always ready. The girl was all alone and looked after everything. But the queen could not but think that she was again the first and most beautiful of all. She went to her looking-glass and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the glass answered, "O Queen, thou art the fairest of all I see. But over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is as fair as she." Then she was astounded, for she knew that the looking-glass never spoke falsely, and she knew that the huntsman had betrayed her, and that little Snow White was still alive. And so she thought and thought again how she might kill her, for so long as she was not the fairest in the whole land, envy let her have no rest. And when at last she had thought of something to do, she dressed herself like an old peddler woman, and no one would have known her. In this disguise she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs. She knocked at the door and cried, "Pretty things to sell, cheap, cheap, very cheap." Little Snow White looked out the window and called, "Good day, my good woman, what have you to sell?" "Oh, good things, pretty things, stay laces of all colors." And she pulled out one which was of brightly colored silk. "Oh, I may let the old woman come in," thought Snow White, and she unbolted the door. She bought the pretty laces. And she said, "Child," said the old woman, "what a fright you look. Come, I will lace you properly for once." Snow White had no suspicion, but stood before her and let herself be laced with the new laces. But the old woman laced so quickly and so tightly that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if dead. "Ha! You were the most beautiful," said the queen to herself, and ran away. Not long afterwards, in the evening, the 7 dwarfs came home. But how shocked they were when they saw their dear little Snow White lying on the ground, and that she neither stirred nor moved, and seemed to be dead. But when they saw that she was laced too tightly, they cut the laces. And then she began to breathe a little, and after a while she came to life again. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman is no one else than the wicked queen. Take care, let no one come in when we are not with you." But the wicked woman, when she had reached home, went in front of the looking-glass and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And it answered as before, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard that, all her blood rushed to her heart with fear, for she saw plainly that little Snow White was again alive. "But now," she said, "I will think of something that shall really put an end to you." She made a poisonous comb, and so she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, and knocked at the door and cried, "Good things to sell, cheap, cheap." Little Snow White looked out and said, "Go away, I cannot let anyone come in." "I suppose you can look," said the old woman, and pulled the poisonous comb out and held it up. It pleased the girl so much that she let herself be beguiled and opened the door. When they made a bargain, the old woman said, "Now I will comb you properly for once." Poor little Snow White had no suspicion and let the old woman do as she pleased. But hardly had she put the comb into her hair than the poison took effect, and the girl fell down senseless. "Ha! You paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman. "Now you are done for." And she went away. But fortunately, it was almost evening when the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying as if dead upon the ground, they at once suspected the stepmother. They looked, and then they found the poisonous comb. Scarcely had they taken it out when Snow White came to herself. And told them what had happened. Then they warned her once more to be upon her guard and to open the door to no one. The queen at home went in front of the looking-glass and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" Then it answered as before, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard the looking-glass speak thus, she trembled and shook with rage. "Snow White shall die," she cried, "even if it costs me my life." Thereupon she went into a quiet, secret, lonely room, where no one ever came, and there she made a very poisonous apple. Outside it looked pretty, white, with a red cheek, so that everyone who saw it longed for it. But whoever ate a piece of it must surely die. When the apple was ready, so she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, knocked at the door. Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I cannot let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs have forbidden me." "It's all the same to me," answered the woman. "I shall soon get rid of my apples. There, I'll give you one." "No," said Snow White, "I dare not take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" said the old woman. "Look, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You eat the red cheek, and I will eat the white." The apple was so cunningly made that only the red cheek was poisoned. Snow White longed for the fine apple, and when she saw that the woman ate part of it, she could resist no longer. She stretched out her hand and took the poisonous half. But hardly had she a bite of it in her mouth than she fell down dead. Then the queen looked at her with a dreadful look and laughed aloud and said, "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony, this time the dwarfs cannot wake you again." And when she came home, she went straight to her looking-glass and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" "O Queen, in this land thou art the fairest of all." Then her envious heart had rest, so far as an envious heart can have rest. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, they found little Snow White lying on the ground. She breathed no longer and was dead. They looked to see if they could find anything poisonous. They unlaced her and combed her hair. They washed her with water and wine, but it was all of no use. The poor child was dead and remained dead. All 7 of them sat around and wept for her. They wept 3 days long. Then they were going to bury her, but she still looked as if she were living, and still had her pretty red cheeks. They said, "We could not bury her in the dark ground." And they had a transparent coffin made for her, so that she could be seen from all sides. And she was laid into it. They wrote her name on it in golden letters, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they put the coffin up upon the mountain and stayed by it and watched it. And birds came too. First an owl, then a raven, and at last a dove. And now Snow White lay a long, long time in the coffin, and she did not change, but looked as if she were asleep, for she was as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was black as ebony. It happened, however, that a king's son came into the forest and went to the dwarfs. He said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin. I will give you whatever you want for it." But the dwarfs answered, "We will not part with it for all the gold in the world." Then he said, "Let me have it as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and prize her as my dearest possession." As he spoke in this way, the good dwarfs had pity on him and gave him the coffin. And now, as they began to carry it, one of them tripped over a tree stump, and the shock brought the poisonous piece of apple out of Snow White's throat. Before long she opened her eyes and lifted up the lid of the coffin and sat up. And she was once more alive. "Oh heavens, where am I?" she cried. The king's son, full of joy, said, "You are with me." And he told her what had happened. "I love you more than anything in the world. Come with me to my father's palace, and you shall be my wife." And Snow White was willing and went with him. And their wedding was held with great show and splendor. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast. And when she had arrayed herself in beautiful clothes, she went before the looking-glass and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The glass answered, "O Queen, of all here the fairest art thou, but the young Queen is fairer by far, I trow." Then the wicked woman uttered a curse, and was so wretched, so utterly wretched, that she knew not what to do. At first she would not go to the wedding at all, but she had no peace, and had to go to see the young Queen. And when she went, she recognized Snow White, and she stood still with rage and fear and could not stir. But iron slippers had already been put on the fire, and they were brought in with tongs and set before her. Then she was forced to put on the red-hot shoes and dance until she fell down dead. But Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after.